Select Reader Interfaces from the Operations Access Control menu on the left. When you attach a reader interface to a controller that is already installed in the system, it will be automatically discovered, as will the associated readers and doors attached to that interface. As mentioned previously, not all controllers will have an associated reader interface. For example, HID and ASA Alloy will not have a separate reader interface because they are built into the controller. For this example, select the Mercury 1502 for configuration. As with controllers, the fields available and required for individual reader interfaces will differ based on the manufacturer and model. The general parameters for a reader interface include: reader interface name. Enter a user-friendly name for each interface. The reader interface type. If the interface was auto-discovered, this field will list the type of controller and be grayed out or read-only. Access controller name provides a drop-down for selecting the controller that the reader interface is attached to. You also have a description field which enables you to enter notes or other useful information. The installer field will be populated for auto-discovered devices but can be edited to include the actual installer or company for reference. Finally, the install date, which is helpful for tracking scheduled maintenance or warranties. When all of the necessary parameters have been entered, click the Auxiliary Input tab to continue. A list of available inputs for the selected controller will be available on your left. Typical uses for the auxiliary inputs are tampers, door strike sensors, door monitors, etc. Selecting an input for configuration will make the details available on the right. The input port should correspond to the physical input that you connected your input device to on the board. The input name should be unique and descriptive of the device that is installed. The debounce time is the minimum time, in milliseconds, that must pass before an input signal qualifies as a real event. Inputs can be configured as supervised or unsupervised. Supervised inputs will be wired differently to allow for a detection of a voltage change which could be indicative of a cut line. The Enable drop-down allows you to disable inputs for which monitoring is not required. The default state is disabled. To activate an input, change this value to enabled. Finally, an input will have a normal state of open or closed, depending on the type of device you are installing and its physical installation. To find whether the normal or idle state is open or closed, monitoring of that input will then look for a change in that normal state. When all fields have been completed, click the Auxiliary Output tab to continue. You should notice that the screen looks very similar to the Auxiliary Inputs tab, with all available outputs listed on the left, and their associated parameters on the right. Typical uses for the output ports are sirens, lights, etc. The output port should correspond to the physical port that you connected your device to on the board. The output name is a required field and should be unique and descriptive of the physical device being controlled via that output. The output duration corresponds to the time, in seconds, that the output will remain active when triggered. This is often used for shunting external alarms or sounding alarms for a specified period of time. The Enable drop-down allows you to disable and enable devices. The default state is disabled. To enable an output, change this value to enabled. Finally, as with inputs, you must configure the default or normal state of the device. For outputs, the choices are normally active or normally inactive. The default is normally inactive. When all information has been entered, click Save to finish the configuration of the reader interface. As mentioned previously, many of the NLSS-supported reader interfaces are automatically discovered. For example, the Mercury 1501, 1502 and HID. However, if you need to add an interface manually, you have that ability via the reader interface configuration screen. An example of an interface that would need to be added manually is the Mercury MR51E. To add an interface manually, you simply click Add. The manual setup of a reader interface is identical to that of an auto-discover device, however, some of the fields that were automatically populated will need to be selected manually. For example, the reader interface name, the interface type, and the access controller name. Additionally, a manually added reader interface, and some auto-discovered devices, will have a field for the RS-485 address. This is a unique number assigned to each reader interface attached to the same controller to allow the controller to distinguish between the various interfaces. It is important that this value matches the address that has been manually set using the available switches on the controller. If necessary, review the previous example for an explanation of each reader interface parameter. Click Save to add the reader interface. Now that we have completed the configuration of the controller and the reader interface, we can move on to the readers. Please return to the Access Control playlist to continue with the next tutorial covering readers.